In this video, we are going to study about the thalamus. So before going into thalamus in detail, we'll see what is diencephalon. Diencephalon, it's the part of the brain. So this area is the diencephalon. It's a part of the brain between the cerebrum and the brainstem. So between the cerebrum and the brainstem, you have this part. This is called as the diencephalon. The cavity within the diencephalon is the third ventricle. The diencephalon comprises two major subdivisions. You have the pars dorsalis. So this area is the pars dorsalis and this area is the pars ventralis. These subdivisions are seen in the mid-sagittal view of the brain and are separated from each other by a shallow groove that is called as the hypothalamic sulcus. So this is the hypothalamic sulcus which divides the diencephalon into the pars dorsalis and pars ventralis. The hypothalamic sulcus extends from the interventricular foramen. So this is the interventricular foramen from here to the rostral end of the cerebral aqueduct. So from here to here you get the sulcus, that is the hypothalamic sulcus. So this is the interventricular foramen and this is the rostral end of the cerebral aqueduct. So extending from these 2 points you get the hypothalamic sulcus. Next we'll see the divisions and subdivisions of the diencephalon. As you know, the diencephalon is divided into pars dorsalis and pars ventralis by the hypothalamic sulcus. The pars dorsalis lies above and dorsal to the hypothalamic sulcus and the pars ventralis lie below and ventral to the hypothalamic sulcus. The pars dorsalis is subdivided into thalamus, metathalamus, which includes the medial geniculate body and lateral geniculate body, and epithalamus, which include the pineal gland, the habenular nuclei and commissure and posterior commissure. The pars ventralis is subdivided into hypothalamus and subthalamus. In the subthalamus, you get the subthalamic nucleus and zona increta. So this is a model to show the thalamus. So this is the thalamus. So it is a large ovoid mass of grey matter lying above the midbrain. So this is the midbrain. Above the midbrain, you have the large oval mass of grey matter. So this is separated from the midbrain by the subthalamus. There are two thalami. So this is the one thalami and this is the another one. There are two thalami situated one on either side of a slit-like cavity, the third ventricle. So between the two thalami you have the third ventricle. So whatever highlighted in the green is the left thalamus. So when you remove the left thalamus, you can see this is the third ventricle. So between the right and the left thalamus, you get a cavity that is called as the third ventricle. So this is the third ventricle. Each thalamus is 3.5 centimeters long and 1.5 centimeter breadth. The long axis of thalami are set obliquely running backward and laterally. So this is the direction of the long axis. The pointed anterior ends are near to the median plane. So this is the anterior end. The pointer anterior end are nearer to the median plane, whereas the posterior ends are separated from each other by the pineal body, superior colliculi and habenular triangle. So this is the posterior end. The posterior end of two thalamus are separated by the pineal gland and then you have the superior colliculus and the habenular triangle. The thalami of both sides, here the left thalamus is removed. So the thalamus of both sides are connected across the median plane by a narrow interthalamic adhesion. So here you get the interthalamic adhesion, and each thalamus forms the most of the lateral wall of the third ventricle. So this is the third ventricle and this is the lateral wall of the third ventricle, and it is formed by the thalamus, and it also forms the floor of the central part of the lateral ventricle. This is the lateral ventricle and this is the thalamus. So the thalamus forms the floor of the central part of the lateral ventricle. Functionally, the thalamus is generally considered as the great sensory gateway to the cerebral cortex. It receives the impulses from the opposite half of the body and transmits most of them to the sensory area of the cerebral cortex, the Brodmann area 3, 2, 1. This is a diagrammatic representation. So here you can see this is the thalamus of both sides. So this is the left thalamus and this is the right thalamus. The thalamus has two ends, an anterior end and posterior end. The anterior end is narrow and it constitutes the tubercle of the thalamus, and it forms the posterior boundary of the interventricular foramen. This is a sagittal section. So here you can see this is the anterior end of the thalamus. So this is the interventricular foramen. So it forms the posterior boundary of the interventricular foramen. The posterior end is expanded and it is known as the pulvinar. It overhangs the medial and lateral geniculate body. So this is the medial geniculate body and this is the lateral geniculate body, and the superior colliculi with their brachia, the superior brachium and the inferior brachium. This is a diagrammatic representation to show the surfaces and the relation. So this is the superior surface and this is the inferior surface, and this is the medial surface and lateral surface. The superior surface in its lateral part forms the floor of the central part of the lateral ventricle. So this is the central part of the lateral ventricle. The lateral part of the superior surface forms the floor of the central part of the lateral ventricle. Its medial part is covered by the tela choroidea of the third ventricle. The inferior surface in the anterior part is fused with the subthalamus. So this is the subthalamus. It is fused with the subthalamus, while its posterior part is free, forming the inferior aspect of the pulvinar. The medial surface, it forms the greater part of the lateral wall of the third ventricle. So this is the third ventricle. So the medial surface of the thalamus forms the lateral wall of the third ventricle. The lateral surface forms the medial boundary of the posterior limb of the internal capsule. So here you get the posterior limb of the internal capsule. The lateral surface forms the medial boundary of the posterior limb of the internal capsule. A linear ridge of white fibers along the junction of the medial and the superior surface is termed as the stria medullaris thalami or habenula stria. Next we'll see about the internal structure. The thalamus consists mainly of grey matter and only a small amount of white matter. When you see the white matter, the lateral surface of the thalamus is covered by a thin layer of white matter that is called as the external medullary lamina. The lateral surface of the thalamus is covered by the external medullary lamina. And in the superior surface, you have a similar layer of white matter that is called as the stratum zonale. Next, you have a vertical Y-shaped sheet of white matter within the thalamus that is called as the internal medullary lamina. So this is the internal medullary lamina. The thalamic gray matter consists of number of nuclei. The gray matter of the thalamus is traversed anteroposteriorly by a vertical sheet of white fiber that is known as the internal medullary lamina, which bifurcates anteriorly to assume a white shaped configuration. So this Y-shaped internal medullary lamina divides the thalamus into three main parts: an anterior part, medial part and a lateral part. The anterior part includes the anterior tubercle and lies between the two limbs of the Y. The medial and the lateral part lie on either side of the stem of the Y. Each of these parts consists of number of nuclei. Next we'll see the thalamic nuclei. The nuclei in the anterior part. The nucleus in the anterior part are collectively called as the anterior nucleus. The nucleus in the medial part. The nuclei in the medial part consist of a large medial dorsal nucleus and a small medial ventral nucleus. Then the nucleus of the lateral part. The nuclei of the lateral part are divided into dorsal and ventral. The dorsal part is subdivided craniocaudally into three nuclei: the lateral dorsal, the lateral posterior and a large caudal nuclear mass, the pulvinar. These nuclei are termed as the dorsal tier nuclei. The ventral part is subdivided craniocaudally into three nuclei: the ventral anterior, the ventral lateral or intermediate and ventral posterior. So these nuclei are termed as the ventral tier of nuclei. The ventral posterior nucleus is further subdivided into a lateral part, that is the ventral posterolateral and the ventral posteromedial. This is a flow chart to show the nuclei of the thalamus. So the thalamus has an anterior part. The nuclei in the anterior part forms the anterior nucleus. So this is the anterior nucleus. Then the nuclei of the medial part consist of a medial dorsal nucleus and medial ventral nucleus. So this is the medial part. So this one is the medial dorsal nucleus, and again you get the medial ventral nucleus. Then the nucleus of the lateral part. The nucleus of the lateral part is divided into ventral and dorsal. The dorsal part again subdivided into lateral dorsal, lateral posterior and pulvinar. So this is the lateral part. In the lateral part you get, this is the dorsal part and this is the lateral dorsal and this is the lateral posterior and this is the pulvinar. And the ventral subdivision of the lateral nuclei again subdivided into ventral anterior, ventral lateral or intermediate and ventral posterior. The ventral posterior again subdivided into ventral posterior medial and ventral posterior lateral. So in this picture you can see this is the ventral anterior and this is the ventral lateral or intermediate, and this is the ventral posterior which is divided into ventral posterior medial and ventral posterior lateral. The other thalamic nuclei, in addition to the above mentioned nuclei, the thalamus consists of the following other nucleus also. the interlaminar nuclei. There are several numbers of nucleus which are embedded in the internal medullary lamina, that is termed as interlaminar nuclei. Then you have the midline nucleus. The midline nucleus or paraventricular nuclei consists of scattered cells that lie between the medial part of the thalamus and the ependyma of the third ventricle. Then you have the reticular nucleus. It is a thin curved sheet of grey matter on the lateral aspect of the thalamus, from which it is separated by an external medullary lamina. So between the thalamus and the reticular nucleus you get the external medullary lamina. Then you have the medial and the lateral geniculate body. So these are located postroventral to the pulvinar, and these nucleus are described as metathalamus. Now we'll see the nuclei in the model. So this is the anterior nucleus and this is the medial nucleus. The subdivisions of the medial nucleus are not here. So you have a medial dorsal and medial ventral nucleus. So here you will get the medial dorsal and here you get the medial ventral nucleus. Then you have the lateral part. So in the lateral part you have, this is the ventral anterior nucleus of the thalamus, and then you have the ventral posterior nucleus, and then you have the lateral dorsal nucleus, and then you have the lateral posterior nucleus, and then you have the pulvinar. In the next video, we'll see the connections of the thalamic nuclei, both the specific nuclei, non-specific nuclei, and the clinical correlations.